Today on BRStv Investigates, likely 98% of you are lighting your tank with either a tried and true T5 fixture or a more modular LED form factor tuned to achieve the same plug-and-play performance of T5's. In either case, I can guarantee you that these 16 different spectrum charts will change the way you look at reef tank lighting. What these charts are and how you can use them to perfect your lights is coming up. Hi, I'm Randy with this Friday's BRStv Investigates, where we put popular reefing gear, theories, and methods to the test by experimenting on our own tanks so you don't have to experiment on yours. And today we're going to start unraveling the secrets behind how a vast majority of tanks in the past, before LEDs, have been so successful using simple T5 plug-and-play technology with only 3 or 4 bulb color choices. And once we understand that, it will be much easier to understand how to emulate T5's success using newer LED technology. So how have lighting technologies like T5's been able to produce epic results? Well, beyond providing a super even spread and distributed blanket of light that eliminates shadows, we believe that much of the answer lies within a proven spectrum mix that's not only capable of meeting the metabolic needs of corals, but also that coral pop and visual appeal we all look for. With that, today we're going to take an in-depth look at what those proven spectrum mixes from individual T5 bulbs actually mean and how that relates to our ability to recreate them using newer LED lighting technology, because if we're being honest with ourselves, almost everything we do with LEDs is primarily related to trying to mimic that known plug-and-play result of T5's. To get started, we pulled a pair of every T5 bulb type on our site from all 3 ATI, KZ, and Giesmann for a total of 16 different bulb types, took spectrum shots for each one, and then measured the PAR output from each pair. Based on that data, we were able to clearly group all 16 bulbs into 6 simple to understand categories, starting with the blue bulbs for coral's metabolic needs, white bulbs for making the tank more visually appealing, blue hybrid bulbs which land somewhere between the blue and white bulb categories, purple hybrid bulbs, and actinic bulb categories, both there for nuances in aesthetic appeal and coral pop, and lastly full spectrum plant bulbs, primarily for uses outside of the display tank, but still worth discussing. By the time all is said and done here, we will not only be able to look at a spectrum chart and tell which bulb category it falls in, but we'll also walk away with a firm grasp on what our tanks will look like when lit with those spectrums without even laying eyes on the tank. The real value from today's test will be how we harness that knowledge, spectrum charts, and our own LED module's adjustment capabilities to more easily achieve the same super successful results that plug-and-play T5's have given us over the years using the more current LED technology that we've all grown to love. So let's find out if we can make good on those guarantees by first looking at side-by-side comparisons of those 16 different bulb options and their respective categories, starting with arguably the most important grouping, the blue bulbs. Looking back on every single light source designed for reef tanks, from metal halides to T5's and now LEDs, all of them have been optimized for providing spectrum peaks in the 435 to 450 range, where, as we can see from this spectrum map, this is primarily the intersection point where the coral zooxanthellae, chlorophyll A, C2, and carotenoids within the coral utilize energy the most efficiently. Simply put, not only is this 435 to 450 range the most important when it comes to coral metabolic health, but it also happens to be the range where we see the best coral fluorescence. If we compare that map to the single most successful light source of all time, the ATI Blue Plus bulb, which has been responsible for hundreds of thousands of successful reef tanks over the years, we see that its spectrum not only focuses just on that 450 nanometer peak, but also focuses on the supporting spectrum to the left and right of that peak in the 390 to 500 range. Probably the most important thing you'll hear today is that the broad spectrum approach to this blue peak, like ATI Blue Plus's 390 to 500, is the only spectrum needed to support coral health, and the lion's share of the discussion about the spectrum from other bulbs today is primarily going to be about that visual appeal alone. With that as a baseline, we found similar spectrum representations in the KZ Super Blue bulb as well as the Giesmann Actinic Blue bulb, both of which are strikingly close to the gold standard ATI Blue Plus, with only subtle differences in the red or near infrared spectrum ranges between the 3. But what does that mean to our eyes in the way that we see these 3 blue bulb category bulbs? Honestly, Ryan and I had a difficult time seeing any difference between them when compared over the same tank, and when we look at the par output using a pair of each bulb type measured 24 inches below each bulb combo in the air, there's only a 2 par difference between them, with the ATI Blue Plus at 56, both KZ Super Blue and Giesmann Actinic Blue at 54 par. With a nearly identical performance in this category, it's easy to see how these 3 bulb types could be interchangeable to achieve the same metabolic health goals as well as visual goals. To create a similar wide blue peak using our LEDs, we really have 2 options. First is using a combination of royal blue LEDs in that 450 peak, coupled with violet LEDs just to the left and blue or cyan LEDs just to the right to create an overall broad spectrum approach to blue lighting. The second is to use LED lights that have already created the blue spectrum peak ratio for you, where all you need to do is adjust the overall intensity. An obvious example of this being lights like the Kessel A360X. Up next, we look at the white bulb category. As I mentioned earlier, bulbs in this category target spectrum mixes that balance out heavy blue spectrums and make the tank more visually appealing by adding an additional spectrum that our eyes perceive as white, meaning additions of green, yellow, orange, and red. Representing the white bulb category, again we find that each ATI, KZ, and Giesmann all have a bulb targeting this whiter spectrum mix, with an ATI Aqua Blue Special, KZ Core Light, and Giesmann Aqua Blue Azure. Comparing the spectrum produced by each of these bulbs side by side, we clearly see that they are not as identical as the last bulb category, and this time the differences are more discernible to our eyes. Although all 3 still share a similar spectrum band in that 380 to 500 range, the ATI Aqua Blue Special tests the widest band throughout that range, but also has the highest peak in the green, yellow, orange, and red, and near infrared. On its own, you should expect the ATI Aqua Blue Special to look to have a warm white or daylight appearance, where the heavier reds and orange accents other warm colors in the tank, like brown coral zooxanthellae or even brown algae, which obviously isn't the most desirable for many reefers. In comparison, the KZ Core Light spectrum shows less representation, primarily in the red spectrum, and subtle shifts away from the blue 450 and 470 ranges, as well as the green, yellow, and orange, which results in a tank color that's pretty close to the ATI Aqua Blue Special. However, the browns are not as prominent in what I would call a mix between warm white and cool white. Comparing the Giesmann Aqua Blue Azure next, there is substantially less red, orange, yellow, and green than the other 2 bulbs, and although the blue peaks are also slightly lower, it does have a more rounded blue band. These shifts away from the 500 to 780 range winds up resulting in a tank that most would consider cool white, and looking at it in the tank, we saw exactly that, a cooler white feel that highlighted far less of the red and brown accented colors, making the Giesmann Aqua Blue Azure the bluest of all 3 in the white bulb category. So much like our LEDs, no one would use warm white or cool white controllable channels on their own, but rather use them to balance out blue lights for visual appeal, which for T5's is commonly done using a 75% blue bulb to 25% white bulb ratio. Similar to bulb ratios like this using LEDs, it's common to max out the blue and add in white until the tank looks good, which in many cases winds up with the white channel set to 25 to 40% max power. Then all you do is adjust both equally to meet your tank's par needs. Many of the better LEDs like AI, Ecotech, Kessel, and Orphic allow you to scale the whites and blues ratios dynamically using a single intensity slider, knob, or app function. Also related to our LED white channels, although our eyes tell us that white is brighter because of the addition of green, yellow, orange, and red, when we measured the par for a pair of each bulb in this white category, we found that they were surprisingly close, if not exactly the same, to the blue bulbs, where the ATI Aqua Blue Special and KZ Core Light both tested at 56 par, while the pair of Giesmann Aqua Blue Azure bulbs were 12% lower at 49, so really not much of a difference at all. The next bulb category we're exploring is what we're calling the blue hybrid bulbs, whose spectrum output strikes a balance between that heavy blue bulb and and the fuller spectrum white bulbs. Again, all three ATI, KZ, and Giesmann manufacture bulbs in this spectrum range, those being the ATI Coral Plus, KZ New Generation, and Giesmann Aqua Blue Coral. To get a better understanding of how these blue hybrid bulbs split the difference between the blues and the whites, let's compare the blue hybrid ATI Coral Plus next to the ATI Blue Plus and the ATI Aqua Blue Special, where we see that really it's just a muted version of the Aqua Blue Special with much less green, yellow, and orange, however still more prevalent than the strictly blue band in the Blue Plus, making the Coral Plus a true hybrid of the two. When we put the ATI Coral Plus next to the KZ New Gen and the Giesmann Aqua Blue Coral, we see that they too follow the same shift away from the fuller spectrum offering, both with less reds, oranges, yellows, and greens, but still maintaining those primary peaks around 435 to 450. The KZ New Gen bulb does have more green in its spectrum, which draws out some of that 470, 480 teal color a bit, and also mutes the 450 peak slightly. Whereas the Giesmann Aqua Blue Coral shows nearly identical spectrum compared to the ATI Coral Plus, yet adds in quite a bit more red and near infrared to the mix, which is an important note to make about red, that it mixes with blue to create a purple tint in the tank, and we'll find out next if that's actually true. As you would expect, just by looking at the spectrum charts, these blue hybrid bulbs definitely create a more cool white look in the tank and is somewhat close to what reefers aim for in a balance between super blue and daylight white. However, if they were the only bulbs on the tank, they still come across as being too white for most reefers' tastes, with the Coral Plus giving off more of an orangey red tint. The New Gen also still white, but very close to the Coral Plus, and the Aqua Blue Coral slightly less orange than the other two, but the red really gives that tank the purple tint haze. If I were comparing these blue hybrid bulbs to channels on an LED module, I would say that we're probably looking at a cool white channel turned higher than the UV, violet, royal, and blues, which very few reefers would choose for their primary peak spectrum ratio, because again, it's visually too white. When we look at the PAR data for the pair of each of these blue hybrid bulbs, it's really not surprising to see PAR numbers similar to the other 24-watt bulbs that we've tested already, where the ATI Coral Plus at 55 PAR is only 16% higher than the Giesmann Aqua Blue Coral at 46, with the KZ New Gen falling right in between at 52 PAR. So for those who are hoping that the blue hybrid bulb would be the one bulb to rule them all and the ideal spectrum mix to emulate, that much green, yellow, orange, and bits of red just wind up highlighting too much of the ugly brown parts of our tanks, and likely why many T5 users use bulb combinations that only wind up using one of them in 4 to 6 bulb fixtures, or maybe 2 in an 8 bulb setup. We've got another hybrid bulb for our fourth category that we're calling the purple hybrid bulbs, because plain and simple, they're purple. However, again, they don't achieve that purple tint in the tank the way most would think. It's that mix of red and blue to create the perception of purple. All three ATI, KZ, and Giesmann manufacture purple hybrid bulbs, with the popular ATI Purple Plus, KZ Fiji Purple, and Giesmann Super Purple bulbs. And when we look at the spectrum side by side, we get a clearer picture into how they're achieving the purple color, and it's by adding in orange and red into the bulbs. Between the three bulbs, there's really only subtle differences in the peaks at 450 and the green and orange peaks. However, there are larger differences in the red and near infrared spectrum, with the ATI Purple Plus having the most representation in that range and the KZ with the least. But will that translate into anything our eyes can discern in the tank? When we looked at these bulbs over the same tank, we saw that the additional reds in the ATI Purple Plus did actually come through, creating a pink to red tint in the tank, while KZ Fiji Purple with less in that red spectrum wound up looking a bit more orange, as its spectrum chart would suggest. The Giesmann Super Purple bulb was closer to what I would consider purple, and somewhat split the difference between the KZ and the ATI, and seemed a little brighter and bluer. However, when we look at the PAR data for a pair of each of the purple bulb, neither of them really outshined the other in the PAR output, where all three fell within just 3 PAR of each other. So how do the purple hybrid bulbs relate to our LEDs? First is that mixing red and blue to create the perception of purple just isn't the same as targeting those 380 to 400 ranges of violet in the spectrum band. And as we're about to see in the next bulb category, it's this violet range where the coral's fluorescence really begins to pop and stand out. Secondly, I just don't think any reefer would max out the red channels with their blues to try and create purple in the tank, especially when most LEDs have individual adjustable channels in those violet ranges, typically labeled UV and violet. But what T5 bulbs do target those lower violet near UV ranges? If you guessed the actinic bulbs, then you're right. This next category of bulbs are synonymous with providing that pop and zing to our corals and really show off the coral fluorescence, especially in greens, yellows, oranges, and blues. There are only two bulbs in this category, the ATI True Actinic and the Giesman Super Actinic, and when we look at their spectrum side by side, for the first time today, we see very specialized and targeted bulbs that both peak right at 420 nanometers, but also include spectrum all the way down to near UV at 380. There is slightly more red in the Giesman Super Actinic bulb over the ATI, which, as we saw from the last category, might actually come through visually in the tank as slightly more purple, but let's find out. When we compared these two bulbs over the same tank, we saw that they both are far more eye-appealing than trying to mix blue and red together like the purple hybrid bulbs, and there was a slightly more purple look to the Giesman bulb that had additional reds. However, to our eye, this low of wavelength does wind up looking dim and most certainly gets washed out fast when you add in white and blue. We were pretty surprised when we measured par for these two actinic bulbs to find out that although they are lower in par from the other bulbs we tested today, with the ATI True Actinic testing at 41 and two Giesman Super Actinics at 38 par, they're only 30% lower than some of the higher par combos, which is a true demonstration of how poorly our eyes can judge par and how there is very little relationship between what our eyes perceive as brightness versus actual par. If our goal is to make the corals look awesome, then these are the bulbs that will do just that. But because we also need to provide the right spectrum mix for metabolic function and coral health, we obviously can't run purely actinic colors all the time, and we need to strike a balance between the two. This is exactly why when we create BRS recommended spectrum ratios in our BRStv Investigates light tests, we start with the UV violet and blue channels turned to max, then we add in some white channels to even out that heavy blue. In relation to common LED modules, I would note that this 380 to 425 range is commonly underrepresented, and even though some modules might have a channel labeled violet or UV, it may not be strong enough to see significant differences in the tank, which is something that you can see on your own before you choose the right LED for you just by looking at its spectrum chart offering. There is another category of bulbs that most reefers likely avoid for display tank purposes, and those are the two full spectrum plant bulbs from Giesman, the Tropic, and Superflora. I won't spend too much time on these two since they are probably the best served for reefers who want a full spectrum option to light a display refugium, mangroves, or something similar. However, it is worth noting their spectrum ranges and how we can see that they shift away from those blue 440 and 460 ranges and instead target green peaks around 540 with differences in the amount of yellow, oranges, and reds between the two. As you would expect, they aren't very attractive over a display tank and wind up looking like a 6,500 Kelvin warm daylight bulb, yet the additional orange in the Giesman Superflora does create an overtly orange display. I think it's also interesting to note that even though visually these two were the brightest bulbs to our eye, they tested on the lower end of par across all the bulbs we tested today, with the Tropic at 45 par and the Superflora at 43. If we were comparing these bulbs to the available LEDs currently on the market, I would liken these plant bulbs to the spectrum mixes targeted by LEDs like the Kessel Tuna Sun, Radion Freshwater, or the AI Prime Freshwater, which again, most reefers wouldn't select for lighting their display tank. Circling back to the beginning of today's episode, now that we have a visual idea of the spectrum produced from T5 bulbs that have resulted in all of those successful tanks for those who have used them in the past, I think it's time to stop guessing and flipping switches on our LEDs and finally come up with a gold standard spectrum to emulate with room for slight tweaks and personal visual appeal. The burning question for those who don't have a spectrometer, which is likely 99% of you, is how do we do this accurately with our own LEDs? First, we're going to give you our BRS recommended T5 bulb mix for 4, 6, and 8 bulb fixtures. Then we're going to do our best to emulate those recommended spectrums using some of the most popular LED options out there. And all of that is in the next episode in this playlist right over here.